we were there. They wouldn't notice us. We would be tiny. If Gursky is there making the photograph, they're going to be completely, necessarily unaware of being photographed. But the apparatus is such, the lens, the film, and so on, that they are seen by the camera. So we're getting a fundamental difference between what the camera can see and what the figures in the picture can see. Not because they're absorbed in this case, but here just simply through the fact of something like distance. And this is going to be very basic to Gursky. The term that I found myself using for this again and again in the book, it's as if the photograph is one at the same time absolutely open to us to look at it. I mean, the structure of pour être vu is incredibly powerful in Gursky, the to-be-seenness. At the same time, it's as if the photograph makes a kind of severing, a kind of cut, a kind of absolute separation between the world of the viewer, by implication the world of the photograph, and the world of what's inside the photograph. Sorry, the world of the photographer, the viewer, and the world of the photograph. On the one hand, everything is to be seen. On the other hand, the sense is of some kind of absolute separation because of complete non-reciprocity between the inside of the photograph and here. May I have the next slide, please, just to show you a quick sample. This is another one of his very strong photos, Salerno, the port of Salerno, 1990. Again, we get these very often in Gursky, these distanced, elevated aerial views in which, in some sense, we don't find ourselves trying to imagine how physically he made the photograph. I mean, on the one hand, we know that we have this elevated point of view, but the photograph doesn't actually lead us to imagine a point of view, imagine a physical point of view. Where was he exactly? It's as if there's just the photograph giving itself to be seen from that angle. And this, again, for me, the sense of separation between the two. May I have the next slide, please? The Tokyo Stock Exchange. And he finds in these scenes of stock exchanges something. We have the world of the stock exchange, everybody totally caught up in that, in its particular conventions and intensities. And then the camera hovering somewhere above, revealing this world. And if you read the criticism, the commentaries on Gursky, again and again critics say things like, and Gursky himself endorses it, it is like as if I came from another planet and I'm photographing from another planet. Or they say, it's as if what Gursky's photographs show us is another world, a world in which we have no part. I mean, Peter Galassi, a well-known curator of photography in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, says this, when we have no part in Gursky's world, it is apart from us. Galassi doesn't say why that would be interesting or why that would be important, and I would agree with that as a description. And again, what I'm trying to say is it's because that separation functions in relation to the whole issue of making paintings that are made to be beheld. On the one hand, they are pour être vu. On the other hand, they seem cut off from the viewer, and that achieves the effect of what I'm calling a kind of anti-theatricality. May I have one more Gursky, which is just to show you Autobahn in Mettmann in Germany, 1993. And here we're looking down at an angle into a field in which we see cows. Those stripes are stripes that have been, in effect, painted or attached to the transparent side of an overpass in an Autobahn in Germany in order to keep people from being so transfixed by what they're seeing down there that they just drive off the Autobahn. And Gursky finds this as a brilliant subject. People have correctly related this to his interest in abstract painting. But again, what fascinates me is the use of this to make this kind of absolute separation, even within the photograph, between that field, the cows below, and the camera where we are. We are separated here by the transparency, by the stripes. Okay? So again and again in Gursky, I see that, the argument of the book is, I see that sort of structure. Now, if we had a lot more time, I have the next slide, please. I would love to talk at length, and I do in the book, about an extremely interesting contemporary photographer, Thomas Demand. whose relation to all these issues is something else again. As many of you will know, 𝙩𝙗𝙢 starts out very often from images that he gets from the media, and he then constructs them life-size in his studio in cardboard, and then photographs them. This is a work called Pole from 2001, and it's his version of the place in Florida where the ballots were counted in the moment of that very contested end of the election between the vile George Bush and Al Gore, okay? When Bush and his people, in effect, stole the election that should never have been that close to begin with. But as you look closely at a photograph like this, and this is always true of 𝙩𝙗𝙢's photographs, you become aware that it's not, at first it looks like it's the place. And then as you look closely, you see that it can't be, that it's been reconstructed. The telephones have no numbers on them. There's no writing on any of the post-its. Those are ballots, but the ballots have no punch marks. They have no lettering. What is 𝙩𝙗𝙢 about? And this is, I don't have the time to develop this fully here. I mean, it could be a lecture in its own right. But I think one of the things that 𝙩𝙗𝙢 is engaged with is the whole issue, the complex question of the relation of photography to the photographer's intentions, and the traditional account of photography in which a photograph can't, by its nature, intend everything that is in it. I mean, you get a version of that in that early Gursky, where he didn't know that those people were in the hillside. The photographs give American photographer Lee Friedlander says photography is a generous medium. It always gives you more than you know, gives you other than you know. Sometimes that's a problem, sometimes that's a gift. It's as if 𝙩𝙗𝙢's project is to make photographs which were completely determined by him, completely the product of his intention. Why is that interesting in this context? For me, it's interesting in this context because it's an attack on the very idea of indeterminacy. And indeterminacy is something that is built into that moment of minimalism, as opposed to high modernism. High modernist works of art are determined by the artist. Minimalism courts and welcomes a kind of indeterminacy. So I would see 𝙩𝙗𝙢's work as being on the side of ultimately the issues of high modernism against minimalism. There's one other moment that in the tradition that's worth evoking here. In Baudelaire's Great Salon of 1846, he has a very interesting section in which which is called "Why Sculpture is Tiresome," ennuyeux. And he gives a number of reasons why sculpture is tiresome. He doesn't like sculpture, but one of the things he says, the most interesting thing he says, and this is quoted at one point by Chevrier, precisely in relation to, actually, to my essay, Art and Objecthood. Baudelaire doesn't like sculpture because he says it doesn't specify the point of view. It is too indeterminate. A painting shows us the world from one spot. It's tyrannical. Art should be tyrannical. Sculpture says you can see it from here, you can see it from there, you can see it from here, you can see it from there. And that, for Baudelaire, is on the side of indeterminacy, and indeterminacy is not a quality that he likes. It's a kind of, it's as if Baudelaire, to put it in an extreme way, sees all sculpture as if it were minimal sculpture. It's like a response to minimalism way avant la lettre. But in any case, and 𝙩𝙗𝙢 starts out life as a sculptor, and then decides that these pieces that he's making don't quite succeed in carrying the intention that he wants as sculpture, but he realizes that if he were to photograph it, then they would. So again, it's to see, it's yet another relationship, but I think a very powerful one, a very original one, to the kinds of issues that are at stake here. May I have the next slide, please? This is a street called Crosby Street, New York of 1978. It's one of a whole series of cityscapes that Struth makes. I think they're quite wonderful. His earliest works, really, black and white camera, a lot of them centered in this way. And this is just to show you something that is the opposite. What Struth is interested in here is the way in which any scene like this, photography has the ability, way beyond the ability of painting or any other medium. Photography has the ability to show us scenes in the world which are a palimpsest, an overlay of previous intentions. Intentions, intentions, intentions. The German writer Robert Musil writes about this in his great, great novel, The Man Without Qualities, as if no one could have intended Crosby Street to look like this. But it looks like this because of the intentions of builders and others over generations. Photography can show that, this trace structure, you could call it, to the world. And that's part of the previous history that sets up the basis for 𝙩𝙗𝙢𝙥𝙨 saying, okay, and I'm going to make photographs where all the traces are simply the traces of my intentions, my making. And it's no accident that in that photograph poll, of course, what took place in that room was the attempt by a whole lot of people to determine the intentions of voters. Right? That was the whole point of looking at those ballots. And it's as if 𝙩𝙗𝙢𝙥𝙨 is taking that and setting up a situation where all the intentions are his. May I have the next slide, please? Just to show you an early photograph, one of the tableaux of Jean-Marc Bustamante. And Jean-Pierre Criqui has written wonderfully about Bustamante. In fact, I learned about Bustamante from Jean-Pierre years ago when we first talked about the project of this book. And you remember the roof before with that face that just looked out at us. And I said it was something about excluding the viewer, keeping the viewer at a distance. Something like that is in play here very powerfully in Bustamante also. May I have the next slide, please? I think the exclusion of the viewer is absolutely what is at stake in the work of Candida Höfer, another of the Becher's students. We get these dazzling, often reflection-filled rooms, which could never look like that in real life. They only look like that to the camera with the exposure of a certain length of time. We get extraordinary detail in the rooms, but we also get the strongest possible sense of not being invited to enter them. We are kept out. And to show you one other work of exclusion, may I have the next slide, please? This is one of Thomas Struth's. Do I have that upside down? I can't tell from where I'm sitting. One of his Paradise pictures. This Paradise 9, it's a forest in China from 1999. Let me start to bring this talk to an end by moving on to the Bechers, who are in many ways one of the sources of this entire development. Bernd and Hilla Becher, he died a few years ago. Hilla is still alive in her mid-70s. They were key figures in Dusseldorf. They were really together the teachers of the whole younger German school. I mean, he was officially the professor, but they were doing it together. And as you all know, I mean, they go out with a black and white camera and with the sustained project over decades, make photographs of industrial structures like this cooling tower, number 1, 1972. So you'll notice that we see the tower, but we also see the ground. We see something of the situation that it's in. There's a fascinating moment to me in an interview with the Bechers, where the interviewer asks them about Carl Andre, the American minimal artist. And Andre was a friend of the Bechers, and he writes, in fact, the first article about them that appears in America in the early 1970s in the influential magazine Art Forum. And they're friends with Andre, and the interviewer says, so do you think of your photographs, your objects, and they call these, they don't speak of industrial structures, they speak of these as objects. Do you think of it as like Andre? Right? These are something like minimal objects. And Bernd says, no, absolutely not. May I have the next slide, please? He says, what Andre is doing is taking these elements that are simply elements to be seen, and he puts them in a particular situation. And they make a certain kind of work in that situation. You're looking at 144 magnesium squares from the late 1960s. But if you took those elements and put them in another situation, which you can, it will be another work. Right? Our objects are grounded in the situations in which they find them. We want to photograph in a way that makes it clear that they are not portable. They are not, in that sense, minimal objects. they belong to a particular situation, a particular history. Right? So it's a different kind of object. You could say the kind of objecthood they want is not the objecthood of minimalism. May I have the next slide, please? And they go on to put the photographs together in these ensembles that they call typologies. And this is, of course, their great achievement, their great innovation. You're looking at Cooling Towers number 2 from 1972, just to show you 2 more. May I have the next slide, please? Cylindrical gasometers from Germany, photographs taken between 1969 and 2001. And then one more photograph. Water towers in New York City from 1978 to 79. And it becomes then a very interesting question what the project of these photographs is. I mean, what's going on in these typologies that should make them as significant as I think they are. On the one hand, it's a documentary project. On the other hand, I want to claim it's also a kind of ontological project. I can't possibly unpack the issues here for you, but it's the last chapter of this book. And I think it has to do with trying to achieve an art that would make something about objects visible in a way that they are not ordinarily visible in the world. To specify a kind of individuality and specificity to the objects they deal with that can only emerge comparatively and as a system of comparisons and contrasts. Philosophically, I read them in relation to some remarkable passages by the German philosopher Hegel, turning on issues of good and bad infinity. But I won't subject you to this here. But I take the project as being something like the revelation through photography of something that I want to call good objecthood. Good objecthood because specified and individual in a way that objects in the world seen non-photographically are not. And then just to end this talk with one more slide that relates to issues of objects. This is Jeff Wall's concrete ball from 2003 in Vancouver. And I see this as something like almost a kind of simple civic monument to something like good objecthood, to something that Wall also calls the everyday, a work that bears a kind of intimate relation of a subtle kind to what the Beckers have achieved. You could almost see it as a kind of tribute to the Beckers, whether consciously intended as such or not by Wall. Okay, you've been very patient. Thank you for your attention. Just short of 6:30, Giovanni.
N'hésitez pas à demander le micro si vous voulez poser des questions.
I can come back after you've all had a chance to read the book.
Ask my question in French.
As you like.
Okay.
I mean, if I need clarification,
okay.
I'll ask you.
Ma question, c'est une question qui est de l'ordre du langage et de l'ordre de la traduction ou de la traductibilité,
Okay.
qui est aussi en rapport avec, avec vos travaux, qui est la notion de spectateur,
Oui.
qui en anglais peut prendre la forme de spectator ou beholder.
Je préfère beholder.
Voilà.
En général.
Et moi, en fait, je voulais vous questionner et me questionner sur la différence qui peut exister sur le plan théorique entre les deux, parce que nous, en français, on n'a guère que spectateur et on n'a pas vraiment l'équivalent de beholder. Et donc, dans votre usage de beholder, je sens qu'il y a quelque chose avec la présence, avec quand on dit hold, le poids d'une expérience ou le poids d'une image.
It's also that in English, beholder goes very easily with the idea of beholding as a kind of condition or an activity. You know, you could say a beholder beholds, and the activity is beholding. It's much harder to say, much stranger to say a spectator spectates, or to say spectating. So it's not that I want to drive a hard distinction. It would feel artificial for me to drive a hard. That's why I had no problem with La Place du Spectateur as a title. It's just that in English, and spectator in English also has a more particular usage. You would say, in a football match, there are 80,000 spectators, right? You would never say there were 80,000 beholders. So spectators tends to go with something like spectacle. So behold is just an easier, more natural word in English in that context. I hadn't actually thought about it a lot, but you know, that's why I prefer. But that's also why I have no problem with spectateur. It's not an ontological issue, if you see what I mean. But I thank you for the question.
C'est une question autour de la première image de Jeff Wall que vous avez posée et sur la force de votre démonstration sur les deux mains du photographe, la main qui est ouverte et la main qui couperait. Et est-ce qu'il n'y a pas dans cette photo de Jeff Wall, comme il y a une main morte quand même, hein, et il y a une main avec un crayon, et que la main morte, elle est presque en train de tenir un déclencheur souple en fait. Hein, de photos, enfin, elle appuie, elle est fermée comme on fait une photo avec la chambre. Est-ce qu'il n'y a pas comment vous voyez ça, ces histoires de mains comme ça dans la...
Yeah, I mean, I didn't talk about that. One could certainly imagine that there's that it's not innocent that it's an arm and a hand, and you could even imagine something like that. The hand would be the instrument of painting. The fact that we have here a cut-off dead hand and arm would be something like an acknowledgement that we're in a kind of regime of picture making, which is no longer primarily a kind of handwerk, but something else. You know, a friend of mine suggested that to me not long ago. I hadn't thought about it myself. But you know, it seems to me a very, you know, and it goes with what you were asking. It seems to me an interesting suggestion. I wish I'd, you know, said something about that in the book. I didn't.
Merci.
Par rapport à la peinture qui était en rapport avec la photo de Jeff Wall, le garçon absorbé par un jeu de cartes, qui n'est pas seulement un jeu de cartes apparemment. Le garçon absorbé, il est un prétexte pour montrer le peintre absorbé. Enfin, c'est un... Et la théâtralité, pour moi, elle est terrible là-dedans, parce que c'est...
Say that again? I mean, what was the last thing you said? I heard the first part.
Donc, comme c'était contre la théâtralité, cette absorption, je trouve que comme si c'est un prétexte à montrer l'absorption du peintre lui-même, c'est d'une terrible théâtralité, justement.
No, see, c'est trop clever. You know, you have to be more simple. You have to be more simple. I mean, you could say of every painting, right? Every painting ever made is made to show the painter painting. So every painting is terriblement théâtral. Okay. You know, if that makes you happy, then you have everything always terriblement théâtral. For me, there's an important set of distinctions that that ignores. in any case, I mean, but what I also want to say is, what sets up the whole attempt to make the paintings absorptive, and this goes in the direction that you say, is the idea that, of course, all paintings are made to be beheld. You know, the primordial, what I call it la convention primordiale, is to be beheld, but that it's precisely at a certain moment, France, 1750s and 60s, that turns out to be something that ambitious painting sets out somehow to deny, neutralize, negate, put in brackets, put under erasure for as long as it lasts. And it becomes terriblement difficile very quickly. And you see that in the raft of the Medusa. But the attempt, the project, the difficulty in the project becomes something like the engine, the motor of ambitious great French painting, from Chardin, Greuze, David, Géricault, on and on, you know, Courbet, all the way to Manet. One of the things that provides the internal motor of that astonishing development is the struggle against theatricality, the doomed struggle against theatricality, à mon avis. But also the other thing I want to say is a subject is never just a pretext. Huh? It's never just a pretext. The artist has a stake in a subject that goes beyond the pretext. It's a vehicle, it's a medium, it enables something, but it's never just a pretext. If it were just a pretext, the artist can't get out of bed in the morning. It's not enough of a motive.
Bonsoir. J'ai relevé dans ce que vous avez dit les mots tyrannie et détermination du point de vue, mais également j'ai vu que vous avez introduit la notion de performance dans l'action de celui qui est photographié et aussi dans l'action de celui qui regarde. Et donc j'ai l'impression que ça crée un espace d'échange ou de liberté, et j'aurais voulu que vous parliez peut-être de cette distance entre deux.
Yeah, that's a very subtle question. I think for Desmond, this issue of like determination is very crucial. But it's also true that he's very interested in the parcours of an exhibition. I mean, on the one hand, it's an area of determination, but there's also a certain amount of freedom. I think that's right. I mean, you know, even it's a hard question to answer. It's a hard question to answer because it's a really good question. Of course, there's a certain area of freedom, but under minimalism, let's say the indeterminacy is fundamental. The idea is, I enter the space and I have this experience. The work is not the work is my experience of the work. And your experience of the work is your experience of the work. And Jean-Pierre's is his, and they're incommensurable. There's no comparison. There's no question of trying to get it right or wrong. It's all, as it were, in that sense, purely subjective. Whereas in something like the modernist works, if we're looking at certain, let's say what Baudelaire wants painting to be, is something like declaring a particular set of intentions, this and not that. And Desmond is trying, you know, to do something like that in these photographs. But of course, let's say if we were looking at a sculpture by, you know, a sculpture I might love by the British sculptor Anthony Caro, it's not just a single point of view. I walk around it, I see it. With a painting, I can approach it, I can go back. It cannot be absolutely tyrannical, but the emphasis is all on the intentions of the artist. that the artist intended it to be this way. The relationships were put there by the artist, not, as it were, put there by me in my experiencing of the work. And something like that is the distinction. But it's a distinction with a certain amount of play in it, as your question, I think, suggests. In that sense, it's not that I perform the Lewis. It's not that if I'm looking at a large photograph by 𝙩𝙩𝙦𝙙𝙦, it's not, the intentions in that photograph are all 𝙩𝙩𝙦𝙦's. It's the way he wants it. Now, I mean, he didn't choose everything, but as he finally makes the photograph, he accepts it. It's what he wants. At the same time, there is something I have to do, looking at it, to fully activate it, to fully enter into it. There's it's not going to be meaningful to me if I'm completely passive, and I say to the photograph, well, you have to just do it to me. I have to, and in that sense, there is a kind of performance, to that extent. We have to, and it's true, I think, for, much more true of art than we acknowledge. To look at a Cézanne and really see the Cézanne, and we have to do a lot. We have to go to the Cézanne and give the Cézanne something for those relationships to start to work, We often, I think, when we teachers, don't often say this enough. Like, as if somehow you're just supposed to learn to appreciate it. But there's something we have to do with many serious works of art in order to activate them, in order to help bring them alive. Then they meet us and they reward us and something happens. And that is a kind of performance. But it's a kind of performance that is meant finally to enable us to grasp what is in the work. Right? It's not what is in me, it is what is in the work. Right? Does that answer a little bit?
Thank you.
Giovanni, if we have a taxi at 7. We have 5 minutes. 5 minutes, okay.
Last question.
Sure.
Je voulais savoir s'il était possible pour vous d'envisager un entre la théâtralité telle que vous la concevez et l'anti-théâtralité, s'il pouvait y avoir une théâtralité qui ne soit pas maniérée, en fait.
So could there be something like a good theatricality? As it were. Yeah. Well, it may be that, in effect, that's what I'm saying with this whole structure of pour être vu, right? This acknowledgement of to be seenness. Someone said to me once, fairly recently, they said, well, don't you really mean by that something like good theater? You're talking now about good objecthood versus bad objecthood. Why not good theatricality versus bad theatricality? And I said, I don't want to go there, but it could be, and certainly there are more, again and again, intellectually, one discovers, and this is a little bit even like the lesson of deconstruction of aspects of Derrida. In order to do certain kinds of intellectual work, and we need certain oppositions, right, and then the oppositions have their ways of breaking down or complicating themselves. But again, what deconstruction meant was not that we then throw away the oppositions, right? The whole brilliance of Derrida was to see that a deconstructive analysis is not a demystification. It's not an exposé. It doesn't mean that from this moment on we can do it. So I want to accept, almost en principe, the fact that the very oppositions I'm working with are deconstructible, that they are deconstructible sur le plan théorique, they are deconstructible by works of art themselves, that in a sense it's happening all the time. In a sense, I would even want to say all of this photography has deconstructed the opposition between theatricality and anti-theatricality, the way it exists in the French painting, but the way it existed for me in 1967 in Art and Objecthood. But the deconstruction, in a way, shifts the ground of the distinctions, changes them, but the distinctions remain important in another way. So the answer to you is yes.
I would like, je peux parler en français, je pense.
Oui.
Je voudrais ajouter quelque chose à propos de la chose qu'elle a dit. En fait, c'est la différence entre good theatrality and bad theatrality, and the good absorption and bad absorption is the consciousness. No, is it not that?
Is what?
Consciousness. The fact that no, it's not that. The
Again,
difference between a good and bad theatrality is the fact that you are conscious that you are able to understand that this is theatrality. Is that?
I don't know. It's a big question.
Okay.